Dawn broke cold and merciless over the frozen command post of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment near Holzheim, France, on January 24, 1945. First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor observed from his position as German artillery systematically demolished the tree line approximately 400 yards distant from his location. Connor, serving as the battalion intelligence officer, was 25 years old and had only recently returned from hospitalization, where he had been recovering from combat wounds that remained incompletely healed. Intelligence reports indicated that the German 19th Army had assembled a formidable assault force consisting of 600 infantry troops supported by 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks. This concentration of forces was designed to execute a devastating counterattack intended to shatter American defensive positions throughout the sector. Connor himself stood 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 120 pounds, presenting an unimposing physical profile. His background before military service consisted of tobacco farming in Clinton County, Kentucky, where formal education had been interrupted by geographical and economic circumstances. The nearest educational institution had been located 15 miles from his family's agricultural property, making regular attendance practically impossible. Connor had volunteered for military service in March 1941, months before the attack on Pearl Harbor that would officially bring America into the global conflict. The intervening years had transformed him through 4 years of continuous warfare, participation in 10 major military campaigns, 4 amphibious assault operations, and 7 separate wounding incidents. His most recent injury had necessitated hospitalization 3 weeks prior to this morning, and he had rejoined his unit merely 2 days before the current German offensive. The 3rd Battalion maintained defensive positions along a critical section of the front line, situated north of what military planners designated as the Colmar Pocket. This pocket represented the final German-controlled territory remaining within France, encompassing approximately 850 square miles of frozen forest and agricultural fields, located west of the Rhine River. German forces had maintained control of this strategic area since November of the previous year, and every Allied attempt to eliminate this defensive pocket had resulted in failure and substantial casualties. The French First Army had suffered thousands of casualties during repeated offensive operations designed to force German withdrawal across the Rhine. Operation Nordwind had commenced on New Year's Day 1945, representing the final major German offensive operation conducted in the Western Theater of Operations. Adolf Hitler had personally ordered Army Group G to achieve a breakthrough penetration of American defensive lines throughout the Alsace region. While the Battle of the Bulge continued raging 300 miles northward, the Nordwind offensive had ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Nevertheless, German forces within the Colmar Pocket remained entrenched and were fighting with the desperation of soldiers who recognized their increasingly dire strategic circumstances. The deteriorating tactical situation. The 3rd Battalion had maintained continuous frontline positions for 18 consecutive days under extraordinarily harsh environmental conditions. Temperature measurements averaged 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit during this period. Lunar illumination was absent, creating darkness that complicated defensive operations and patrol activities. Snow coverage blanketed the entire operational area, creating both concealment opportunities and movement challenges. American soldiers attempted to sleep in frozen foxholes during whatever brief periods rest became possible. German reconnaissance patrols probed American defensive positions every night, seeking weaknesses and gathering intelligence. Battalion casualty reports documented 43 soldiers lost during the previous 2 weeks, with the majority of these losses attributable to German artillery fire and precision sniper operations. Connor's assigned duties as battalion intelligence officer involved gathering information regarding enemy movements and dispositions, conducting interrogations of captured prisoners, analyzing patrol reports submitted by reconnaissance elements, and maintaining detailed maps marking known and suspected German positions. Under normal circumstances, this represented a non-combat staff position. Intelligence officers traditionally remained behind established front lines, working primarily with documentation and analytical reports rather than engaging in direct combat operations. However, Connor's service record over 4 years of warfare demonstrated a consistent pattern of behavior that diverged dramatically from traditional staff officer conduct. He had earned 4 Silver Star decorations for direct combat actions that placed him in immediate life-threatening danger. These awards had been earned in October 1943 during Italian operations, January 1944 at the Anzio beachhead, September 1944 during French operations, and most recently in February 1945. Each Silver Star citation represented specific incidents where Connor had deliberately risked his life to preserve the lives of fellow soldiers under his command or protection. Within the 3rd Battalion, Connor had developed a particular reputation among both officers and enlisted personnel. When tactical situations deteriorated to desperate circumstances, Connor invariably moved forward toward the greatest danger rather than seeking protection or remaining in safer rear positions. The German assault begins. At precisely 07:15 hours, the German artillery barrage intensified dramatically in both volume and accuracy. Shells systematically walked across the battalion's forward defensive positions with professional precision. Trees exploded violently under high-explosive impacts, sending massive splinters and trunk fragments in all directions. Frozen earth fountained upward in enormous geysers as shells detonated across the defensive sector. The preparatory barrage continued for 12 minutes of sustained bombardment before abruptly ceasing. An eerie silence descended across the battlefield momentarily before being broken by the unmistakable sound of heavy tracked vehicle engines approaching from the German lines. A messenger burst frantically into the battalion command post with urgent tactical intelligence. German forces were advancing in strength. 6 Tiger tanks were leading the assault, with hundreds of infantry soldiers moving through the wooded terrain behind the armored spearhead. The advancing formation was approaching the battalion's left flank position in what appeared to be a coordinated combined arms assault. The battalion commander studied the tactical map with growing concern. If the Tiger tanks successfully reached American defensive positions, they would systematically roll through the foxhole line, crushing defenders and destroying positions with their 88mm main guns and hull-mounted machine guns. The battalion would face complete destruction or encirclement. No American tank assets were positioned to counter this armored threat. No tank destroyer units were available within the immediate sector. The only weapon system capable of stopping 6 Tiger tanks under current circumstances was concentrated artillery fire, but artillery batteries required forward observation capabilities to achieve effective results. Someone needed to physically observe the German advance from a forward position. Someone needed to provide real-time adjustment of artillery fire to ensure shells landed accurately on advancing enemy forces. The established forward observation post had been completely destroyed during the initial German artillery barrage. The personnel manning that position were either killed outright or wounded sufficiently to prevent them from continuing their duties. No personnel at the battalion command post possessed visual observation of the German advance due to terrain features and tree coverage blocking sight lines. Connor carefully examined the tactical situation map spread before him. The German advance was progressing through a heavily wooded section of terrain approximately 400 yards distant from the command post building. To effectively observe this attack and direct supporting artillery fire, someone would need to traverse 400 yards of open ground while exposed to German artillery fire, then establish and maintain an observation position forward of the American defensive line, while 6 Tiger tanks and 600 German infantry soldiers advanced directly toward that exposed position. Connor collected a field telephone and 400 yards of communication wire. He looked briefly at the battalion commander, acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them regarding what needed to be accomplished. Without further discussion or delay, Connor departed the relative protection of the command post and entered the frozen landscape outside. The desperate sprint. The German artillery barrage had temporarily ceased, but Connor's combat experience informed him this cessation would prove brief. German tactical doctrine consistently employed preparatory artillery fires before tank-supported infantry assaults. The attacking forces would close distance with American positions before German guns resumed firing to suppress defenders and provide covering fire as Tigers advanced into direct contact. Connor began running across the open terrain separating the command post from the forward defensive line. 400 yards of exposed ground covered in snow lay before him. The telephone wire unspooled continuously behind him as he moved. He carried the wire spool in his left hand while gripping the telephone handset in his right hand. His boots broke through the frozen snow crust with each running step, creating additional resistance and energy expenditure. At approximately 250 yards distance, an artillery shell destroyed a tree directly in Connor's intended path. The massive trunk split longitudinally down its center. Half the tree crashed downward across the snow-covered ground, creating a substantial obstacle. Connor vaulted over the fallen trunk without stopping or reducing his forward momentum. Shrapnel fragments had torn through the smaller branches surrounding the impact point. Pieces of superheated metal fragments hissed audibly as they contacted snow and frozen earth. Another shell landed closer to Connor's position, approximately 15 yards to his left side. Frozen earth and snow geysered upward in a massive fountain. Chunks of dirt and ice rained downward across Connor's body and surrounding area. The blast wave hammered against his eardrums with painful intensity. He could no longer hear his own labored breathing, only a high-pitched ringing tone that filled his auditory perception. Connor reached the American front-line defensive positions at approximately 300 yards distance from his starting point. Soldiers crouched in their frozen foxholes, staring with expressions of disbelief at an intelligence officer running toward the advancing German assault force while carrying a field telephone. Connor did not pause to provide explanations or instructions. He continued running forward beyond the defensive line toward the enemy positions. 30 yards beyond the American foxholes, Connor located suitable terrain for his purposes. A shallow drainage ditch, perhaps 18 inches in depth, ran across the landscape. This ditch provided insufficient depth to stop rifle bullets or protect against artillery fragmentation, but it offered adequate depth to provide Connor with observation sight lines toward the German advance while keeping his physical silhouette below the snow level and reducing his visibility to enemy observers. Connor dropped into the narrow ditch. The telephone communication wire had maintained its integrity throughout his movement. He cranked the field telephone handset to generate the electrical signal. The connection buzzed with static before a human voice responded. The Artillery Fire Direction Center, located 3 miles behind the frontline positions, acknowledged Connor's call. 12 American 105mm howitzers stood ready to provide fire support. These weapons possessed sufficient firepower to devastate a German assault formation if their shells landed accurately on target positions. Connor transmitted his current position coordinates to the Artillery Fire Direction Center. The artillery officer confirmed receipt of this information and stood ready to receive fire mission requests. Connor had effectively become the eyes of the 3rd Battalion's artillery support. Everything now depended on what he could observe from this exposed forward position and whether he could survive long enough to direct the guns accurately onto advancing enemy forces. Connor raised his head cautiously above the rim of the shallow ditch. The German infantry forces were approximately 200 yards distant, advancing through the wooded terrain in professionally executed squad formations. Soldiers carried their rifles at the ready, moving in short tactical rushes. One squad would advance, while another squad provided covering fire from stationary positions. These were experienced professional soldiers who understood proper assault techniques against defended positions and executed them with disciplined precision. Behind the advancing infantry line, Connor observed the Tiger tanks. 4 of the massive 60-ton armored vehicles were visible from his current position, pushing through smaller trees as though they were insignificant saplings. The Tigers maintained positions within the tree line, utilizing available forest coverage for protection while methodically advancing. They would break into open ground within minutes if their advance continued unimpeded. The German infantry had not yet detected Connor's presence. He occupied an isolated position 30 yards forward of the American defensive line, lying in a ditch that provided almost no protective value, armed with nothing but a field telephone, while 600 German soldiers marched directly toward his location. Connor lifted the telephone handset and transmitted fire mission coordinates to the Artillery Fire Direction Center. Enemy infantry in open terrain, 600 meters distance, adjusting fire. The first artillery salvo would arrive in approximately 40 seconds. If German forces spotted Connor's position before the shells impacted, they would kill him before he could adjust subsequent fire missions. If the artillery shells landed too close to his exposed position, they would kill him through fragmentation or concussive force. If the shells landed too distant from the German advance, the assault would continue unimpeded and 600 German soldiers would overrun the 3rd Battalion's defensive positions. Connor watched the German infantry continue their methodical advance while mentally counting the seconds until artillery impact. 38 seconds, 39 seconds, 40 seconds. The sky erupted with the screaming sound of incoming artillery. 12 105mm shells impacted the tree line 150 yards behind the German infantry formation. The shells had landed too far beyond the advancing troops to cause casualties. Connor immediately grabbed the telephone handset and transmitted correction data. Drop 100 meters. Fire for effect. The German infantry maintained their advance without apparent reaction to the artillery impacts behind their formation. Artillery fire landing beyond an advancing assault force represented normal defensive fire from troops attempting to engage without proper forward observation. The German soldiers understood they possessed time before American artillery adjusted to accurate firing coordinates. However, Connor was not guessing at coordinates or firing blindly. He could observe every German soldier, every tactical movement, every squad leader signaling his troops forward with hand gestures. The second artillery salvo arrived 18 seconds after Connor's adjustment transmission. This time the shells landed directly within the center of the German infantry formation. The forest terrain erupted in catastrophic violence. Trees disintegrated under high explosive impacts. Shrapnel fragments screamed through the air in every direction. Each 105mm shell contained 14 pounds of high explosive. 12 shells detonating simultaneously delivered 168 pounds of explosive force among 600 men compressed into tight assault formations. German soldiers disappeared in the explosions. Others collapsed to the ground with catastrophic wounds. The organized advance halted abruptly as unit cohesion disintegrated. Connor cranked the telephone handset and transmitted new instructions. Repeat fire on same coordinates. Another salvo crashed down on the same terrain, then another. The American artillery battery was now firing for maximum effect at maximum sustainable rate. 4 rounds per gun per minute meant 48 shells every 60 seconds, hammering the same 200 square yard section of forest where German infantry had concentrated. The German infantry formation scattered in all directions. Squad formations broke apart completely. Individual soldiers ran desperately for any available cover. Some dove behind tree trunks. Others attempted to crawl away from the impact zone on their bellies. The forest had transformed into a killing ground where survival depended on luck rather than skill or training. However, the Tiger tanks continued their relentless advance. Connor could now observe all 6 armored vehicles. The artillery barrage had not affected them in any meaningful way. 105mm shells could potentially damage a Tiger tank's tracks or optical equipment through lucky hits, but they could not penetrate the thick armor plating that made Tigers among the most feared weapons on the battlefield. The Tigers required multiple direct hits, and even concentrated fire might prove insufficient against their armored protection. The 6 tanks advanced in a professional wedge formation, with 2 tanks leading, 2 following behind them, and 2 more bringing up the rear of the formation. Tank commanders stood in their turrets scanning the American defensive positions for targets to engage. One of the Tigers fired its 88mm main gun. The crack of the discharge sounded like a thunderous explosion. The shell struck an American foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right side. Dirt and snow exploded upward in a massive geyser. The soldiers occupying that foxhole were instantly killed. Another Tiger fired at a different target. Another American foxhole was obliterated. The advancing Tigers were now 300 yards from the American defensive line. In approximately 4 minutes, they would reach the foxhole positions. Once the 60-ton armored monsters crossed the defensive perimeter and operated in the rear of American positions, the result would be catastrophic. Panic would spread among defenders. Units would break and run. Hundreds of soldiers would flee the battlefield. German forces would pursue the retreating Americans and slaughter them during the chaotic withdrawal. The Tigers would then push deeper into 6th Army Group's operational sector, potentially causing a collapse of the entire front line. Connor shifted his fire mission instructions to engage the advancing armor. Enemy tanks advancing, 250 meters, adjust fire onto armored targets. The fundamental problem with this fire mission was precision. Artillery systems were not designed or optimized for destroying individual tank targets. Artillery saturated designated areas, killing infantry soldiers caught in the open, destroying buildings and structures, cutting communication lines and disrupting logistics. However, tanks represented small targets that moved rapidly and carried thick armor protection. The artillery shells began falling around the advancing Tiger formation. One shell landed approximately 10 yards in front of the lead Tiger. The massive tank drove directly through the blast effect without slowing or deviating from its course. Another shell impacted behind the formation. The Tigers maintained their advance pace. The tank commanders understood that American 105mm guns could not stop their armored vehicles. They would drive through the artillery fire and into the American defensive positions where their main guns and machine guns would devastate the defenders. Connor required the shells to land more accurately on target. He transmitted new adjustment data. Drop 50 meters. Fire for effect. The next artillery salvo landed among the advancing Tiger tanks. A shell scored a direct hit on the lead tank's right track assembly. The heavy track broke apart under the impact. The 60-ton Tiger slewed hard to the right side and ground to a halt. The tank was immobilized but remained dangerous. Its turret traversed smoothly as the crew searched for targets. The 88mm main gun remained fully operational. A disabled Tiger with a functioning main gun still represented a fortified firing position capable of destroying American defensive positions. Another Tiger took an artillery shell impact on its engine deck. Dense smoke began pouring from the rear of the armored vehicle. The crew might abandon the damaged tank, or they might continue fighting from an immobilized position. A Tiger with engine damage but intact weapon systems remained a significant threat. 4 Tigers continued their advance without significant damage, and they had adjusted their movement pattern. The tanks were now moving directly toward Connor's position. The tank commanders had identified the source of the deadly accurate artillery fire. They had observed the telephone wire running across the snow-covered ground. They understood that someone was directing American artillery from a forward observation position, and they were advancing to kill that observer and eliminate the artillery threat. Connor examined his shallow ditch. 18 inches of earth provided insufficient protection to stop an 88mm tank shell. The ditch offered no protection against machine gun fire. It would not stop anything a Tiger tank could direct against his position. The German armored vehicles were now 150 yards from Connor's exposed position, close enough that he could observe the Balkenkreuz identification markings painted on the turrets, close enough to see the faces of the tank commanders standing in their open turrets. Connor lifted the telephone handset one final time and transmitted coordinates that would change everything. Fire on my position. The artillery fire direction officer repeated the coordinates back to Connor for confirmation. Connor acknowledged the coordinates were correct. The officer asked Connor to confirm his request a second time. Calling artillery fire on one's own position violated standard operating procedures. It meant friendly shells would land within yards of the forward observer's location. It meant the observer faced high probability of death from friendly fire. Connor confirmed his fire mission request a third time without hesitation. 40 seconds elapsed before the first shells arrived. The artillery impacted 30 yards in front of Connor's ditch. The concussive wave felt like being struck by a speeding truck. Air pressure changed dramatically around his body. His lungs compressed painfully. His vision blurred from the pressure wave. Frozen dirt clods and razor-sharp shrapnel fragments screamed overhead through the space his body had occupied seconds earlier. The sound transcended thunder, resembling nothing less than the apocalyptic end of the world. Connor remained motionless in the shallow ditch. He kept the telephone handset pressed firmly against his ear despite the catastrophic violence occurring around his position. He transmitted new adjustment data through the noise and chaos. Drop 20 meters. Repeat fire for effect. The next artillery salvo landed 20 yards from his position, close enough that he could feel thermal heat radiating from the explosions, close enough that shrapnel fragments tore through the air approximately 6 feet above his head at supersonic velocities. If Connor stood upright, the shrapnel would shred his body instantly. If the artillery shells landed merely 10 yards closer to his position, the shallow ditch would provide no protection whatsoever. The advancing Tiger tanks had halted their forward movement. Tank commanders had closed their turret hatches and buttoned up inside their armored vehicles. The artillery was landing dangerously close to the tanks, and even veteran Tiger crews preferred not to remain exposed outside their armor when American shells were detonating at point-blank range. However, the German infantry forces were rallying despite their earlier casualties. Connor could observe them forming up again into organized formations. Approximately 200 soldiers had survived the initial artillery barrage. They were utilizing the immobilized Tigers for protective cover, staying behind the massive armored hulls, moving when the tanks moved forward, using the 60-ton vehicles as mobile fortresses against artillery fire. The advancing Tiger soldiers had continuing their assault despite devastating casualties. Connor adjusted artillery fire continuously, walking the shell impacts back and forth across the German advance. Every time a group of infantry soldiers attempted to move forward, Connor dropped high explosive shells directly on their position. Every time the Tigers advanced, he called fire immediately in front of their hulls. One Tiger tank took a direct artillery hit on its turret. The shell did not penetrate the thick armor, but the tremendous impact damaged the turret ring mechanism. The turret would no longer traverse to engage targets. The tank could only fire directly ahead, rendering it effectively useless in a fluid combat situation. Another Tiger tank lost its second track to artillery damage. 2 broken tracks meant the massive vehicle could not move at all. The 5-man crew scrambled out of the disabled tank through the turret and hull hatches, running desperately back toward German lines.